Jason, the floor is yours. Welcome, Jason Danely.
Thank you so much, Lori, and great to see all of you here from all different sort of diverse backgrounds and interests. Yeah, it's great to be here. And I did the Inside Out training a couple of years ago, and I'm just now sort of proposing, my first Inside Out class. We'll see how that goes. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of negotiations and things like that ahead. But I'm still so excited about Inside Out and what it brings, and the whole ethos and everything behind it. And part of that is this community that Lori and all of you have sort of built together, which I think is amazing. Um, so uh, have been involved in a kind of educational partnership that my university has with an open prison. Springhill, here close by. And so we have students that come from the prison on sort of temporary release to come to the campus to take classes and study, and then they go back to the prison. We have that program, and we've had some amazing students come through and really do some inspiring work. But it's not the same, right? And I feel like there's a lot of other folks, that maybe aren't ready for that kind of experience yet, but that would really, really benefit from stuff like Inside Out. So I still think there's a place for that. I'm still going to keep on pursuing it. And yeah, we're going to see
Tell us,
how we
tell
do
us
it.
what school you are at.
I teach anthropology at Oxford Brookes University, and that's in Oxford, UK. I've been there for about 10 years. And before that, I was in the States. I was born in the States, grew up there in Detroit. And I think, see, the first time I went to Japan, I was still in high school. I went there for a summer exchange program sponsored by Mazda. And basically I just wanted to get as far away from Detroit as I could, and I thought that Tokyo, that or Japan, that's the farthest away I could possibly get if you look on the globe. And it was fantastic. I fell in love with it. I decided I'm going to do whatever I can to get back and spend some more time there. So I studied the language, and I went over there for an exchange. I lived in Tokyo, in Setagayaku, actually, for a couple of years, and before going to graduate school in the States, in San Diego. And at that time, I wasn't sure what I wanted to, specialize in, what I wanted to study. But I was really interested in all of these older people that I was meeting in Japan when I lived there. So I thought, well, I'll do something around that, right? So I got another chance to go back to Japan, and to basically I was hanging out with older people, listening to their stories, getting their life histories, seeing what their everyday life is like. And Japan has the oldest population in the world. It's almost 30% of the population over 65. And this is increasing. By mid-century, it'll be 40% of the population over 65. And this is something that, no country has ever experienced in sort of the history of human civilization. So it's a real pioneering country in that way. But people really live a long time in Japan, which is also something that you may know, and it's very famous, centenarians and sort of that very big thing. And the kind of general impression, even when I talk to folks who study aging and gerontology, is that well, Japanese people really respect and revere their elders, and they really take care of them, and it's just sort of this cultural thing, and yet spending time there and spending time with older people in Japan, I started to see that the picture was a little bit more complicated, maybe. And especially as the population ages and you have fewer and fewer children, it gets a little bit harder, I think, to make sure that you're caring for all those older people adequately, integrating them into society and so on. So as I continue to do this work about older people and care, uh, I um, I started to hear stories, right? As one does, for sometimes from professional care workers or from other people, uh, about older people who kind of live alone, who are living in impoverished conditions, who can't take care of themselves, and some of these folks were older people who had. Had been living in prison and had come out of prison and were really struggling. So I got kind of interested in this idea, and that's sort of um, quick version of how I got to writing this book. So I'm going to share my screen now and tell you a little bit about that. Okay. Um, So this is my book. This is the what I want to talk about in today's talk. It's called Unsettled Futures, Carceral Circuits, and Old Age in Japan, published by Vanderbilt University Press. And I'll share a flyer with a discount code in case anyone's interested and wants to read more after this talk. But um, this was supported by an Abe Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council of the United States. Um, so let me get something off my screen. Um, yeah, so the book, basically that it's trying to make some connections here, and one of the connections that I'm sort of making is between ageism and criminalization. Uh, and I'll talk more about that. But essentially, I'm making the case that although, older people are held in high esteem in some ways in Japan, there is still a lot of prevalent ageism in a kind of institutional, systemic level. And a lot of older people aren't finding their place in society as a result. They get isolated, they become impoverished. All of these things happen because they get more and more marginalized, and that puts them at greater risk of getting caught up in the criminal justice system, going to prison, and getting caught in a kind of cycle, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the other thing I want to talk about in the end is connections between justice and kinship. Uh, I think getting out of that cycle, trying to find a new way, trying to, find a new life. A lot of the things that I saw when I was doing this research um, had to do with building relationships, new relationships. A lot of these guys who I talked to who had been to prison had lost their ties to their family members, to their blood kin, but they were able to somehow sort of make new connections to kind of replace that, and that was the way that they found, the possibilities for rebuilding their life. So I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Um, So around the time I started my research, there were a lot of stories in the news about Japan's aging prison population, Japan's prisons becoming like nursing homes, older men and women who were committing crimes in order to go to prison because it was a kind of a way for them to access care and so on. So this was something that was in the not only the national but also in the international media. It was getting a lot of attention, but I hadn't seen a whole lot of research on this, and I really wanted to know what's the story behind this. Right? It's pretty difficult to do research in prisons with incarcerated people in Japan. You can sort of do questionnaires and surveys sometimes, but they're very strict about who has any access to folks that are incarcerated. Um, so it was difficult for me to do that kind of work. Uh, so I chose to do some work with people who were had formerly incarcerated and had been recently released and were kind of finding their way in resettlement. Um, yeah, this idea that older people are trying to get into prison has become, yeah, not only in the media, but it's also become a topic that you see sometimes in movies. This is a fictional movie that came out recently called, the English title is Do Unto Others. And there's a scene in it where there's a character who's an older woman who's begging this lawyer to help her to get into prison. The lawyer's trying to like get her out of it and trying to find another way, but this woman's saying, "No, no, I don't have anyone on the outside that's going to help me. So, the best thing for me is to go back to prison." Um, so this kind of narrative is now coming out, which, has a lot of power and a lot of sort of shock value, I guess, in a society that supposedly traditionally respects their elders, right? Um, so what I did in my research, I decided I'm going to go to Japan. I spent about half a year there in the greater Tokyo area, mainly in 2018. I was doing participant observation, so I was um, spending a lot of time, as much of time as possible as I could, sort of shadowing people or being in those places where I would be able to have just normal everyday interactions with people. Mainly, I did this at first by kind of volunteering and working at a few different uh, non-governmental organizations or charity organizations that help with ex-offender resettlement or helping people who are unstably housed or these kind of things. People and organizations that tend to help out um, guys who've been to prison and have come out. And then through those organizations, I was able to meet older guys who were in prison. Um, then I would tell them about my research. If things go well, if they're interested, we would talk more. We might do a kind of one-on-one interview where they could really go into their story in more depth. Um, and that was the sort of gist of it. Um, but I just tried to spend time with folks, and sometimes that was just watching TV, and sometimes we go out for a meal, or we'd be going to shopping, um, going to church, Bible study, all these things. So just wherever people were going, I was kind of tagging along. But I wasn't able to actually get in the prison. This is about as close to the prison as I got. That building in the background is the biggest prison in Japan, Fuchu prison. And this is a kind of picture I took at a culture day that they were having, where they invited the community to the prison grounds to have a kind of community festival. Um, I also spent a lot of time in places like this, places where there were a lot of low-income people yeah, in Tokyo. And a lot of these establishments down the street were places where guys would typically stay when they came out. A lot of guys would stay when they came out of prison. Um, I have doing this kind of participant observation work, would allow for kind of spontaneous encounters to occur. And in one instance, I was volunteering at this organization. I was doing some work in the office for them, and somebody came in, a man, gray hair, came in, and he was looking for some help. So he had come out, since he had come out of prison, he was staying in a kind of um, what do you call it, like a resettlement support facility, a kind of halfway house, right? Until he could get on his own feet. But his time there was drawing to a close after 6 months. They kind of kick you out, and he still didn't know where to go. He couldn't get a job. For older people, of course, it can be difficult to find employment, especially if you've got a record. And he didn't have any money to sort of get his own apartment and so on. And so he was real scared, frankly, and came to this organization for help. The organization does typically help out guys like this, might find, welfare benefits that they could use, or might find an apartment or something like that that would accept someone who's come out of prison. Um, but the manager wasn't there at the time, so I kind of struck up a conversation with him. And I asked him a little bit about, how he's been feeling, and how it feels to be out of prison. Um, and he told me, he said, it's there, it's in me, my feeling, my kokoro. That means like heart, in my heart. I don't really know how to explain. I don't think I can face other people, and I can't tell anyone about where I was or what I did. So it's like there's a wall or a fence between me and the life of ordinary people. So even though he was outside of the prison, it was sort of beyond the walls, um, he still felt like there was that wall up. And this was something that I encountered, I heard about in different ways from a lot of the guys that I talked about. Um, and something that they carried with them, something that made it really hard just to interact with anybody in life, and it was a real struggle. So that was really profound, and it showed me how difficult it is to resettle. This is why I call the book, Unsettled Futures, because these, getting out, you weren't just sort of naturally going to be able to resettle. These guys were living lives that were perpetually unsettled, by all these different factors: isolation, the shame, the fear, the emotions as well. And so that was a big part of what I was trying to understand. For older guys, I think it was, there were even more difficulties, like I said, finding places to stay, getting work, health difficulties, and so on. So they faced some real challenges there. Um, so I think, in a lot of countries in the world right now, prison populations are kind of gradually aging. I know this is so in the States. I know this is very much so in the UK. Um, but I think Japan is also still kind of unique for a couple of reasons. One is that um, most of the older guys in prisons in Japan, that they haven't sort of come in younger and aged in prison because of long sentences, which you typically find in other countries. Um, they actually, committed these crimes, and were arrested and were sent to prison as older adults already. So about 23% or so of arrests tend to be people over the age of 65. Uh, and yeah, about of those arrests, about not all of them go to prison, but about 14, I think it's 14% of people that enter prison each year are over 65. Um, a lot of times in this kind of prison research and stuff like that, they count older people as anyone over 50, because they say if you're in prison, then you're like 10 years older than you physically, or something like that. Then so it's comparable. But in Japan, they got a lot of statistics on people over 65, because there are just so many. It's about I think 12 or 13% of the prison population, definitely the oldest in the world. and growing year on year as far as a proportion of the prison population. Even though, crime and numbers of incarcerated people is declining, steadily declining over the years, the proportion of those in prison who are over 65, who are older people, is going up. And of those people that are in prison, those older people in prison, about three-quarters of them have had sort of prior time had spent prior time in prison. So these are also individuals that are reoffending, and the recidivism rate for older people is higher than any other age cohort. So yeah, about half of them will end up back in prison in within 5 years of release. Um, Now, the vast majority of the offenses that they're arrested for are nonviolent. They're mostly theft, shoplifting, or like really kind of things that we would kind of consider these very minor petty crimes. And if we look at um, older women, for example, about 80% of the crimes that they've committed to then that got them into prison is shoplifting. So about 80% of cases, women are going to prison because of shoplifting. But their numbers have grown considerably over the years. Anyway, I could go over this for ages, but because I find it fascinating. But I went and I asked people about this too. I met an older man who had been to prison a few times, and I just asked him, why is it? Why do older people like keep on going back to prison? And he just looked at me and he kind of told me, oops. If you've been in once, you go a second time. If you've been in twice, you go a third. He left it at that. Um, and I thought about this. This is something, I think there's a kind of rhythm that a lot of these folks got into, right? They would come out for a bit, and then, things might get difficult, and then they sort of go back into prison for a little while. Short sentences, maybe a year, 2 years, and then they'll come out again and spend a little time outside and then go back and then back and forth and back and forth. And that's how a lot of these older folks are getting into prison. So it's been kind of called, this final refuge of the abandoned, right? The people who have no other place in society, and who might struggle on the outside, might end up here. This is a picture of a cell. Usually, guys, and a lot of the guys I talked to spent time in prison in cells like this, where you would have usually around six people staying in there, sleeping on these sort of mats on the ground. Um, yeah, not the greatest conditions. Um, Kind of stressful. A lot of guys said like, I don't really have time to just sort of think and reflect and be still. Like I'm always sort of thinking about these other guys in the room and trying to manage that. So it was kind of stressful. But there might be some benefits as well to this life, especially for some older people. Compared to life on the outside, they don't really have to make any decisions for themselves. They don't have to worry about where they're going to live, where am I going to get my food, all of these things. Everything is sort of decided there. Um, I mean, you don't really sort of do anything in a Japanese prison unless you're ordered to do it. So it's just a matter of following these rules. And I think for some guys that was easier than being on the outside, where they didn't know how to navigate the world and they didn't have any help. Um, so a lot of them said prison's easy. That's why you go back. Prison's easy. It's not free, but it's easy. And life on the outside, however, was free, but it wasn't easy. It was difficult. And and that was the real kind of dilemma for them. So in prisons like this, you usually work. Everyone has to work. That's most of the day, and work is always done in silence. It's very strictly regimented. Pretty much a whole day is in silence. And there's strict rules about even sort of looking at other guys in prison. You know, one guy I talked to. When he came out of prison, he had real trouble crossing the street at like a crosswalk because he would see all these people coming towards him, facing him, right? And in the prison, you would always, if two groups of people are sort of passing each other in the hall, right? One group would have to face the wall so they don't make eye contact with anyone else that's in the line that's coming the other way. You see what I mean? So he would kind of come to this, and he almost couldn't get himself to cross the street because he felt so uncomfortable with the oncoming faces of people. So it's a very regimented life, very strict, but on the other hand, it's also there's very low problems with violence and some of these things that we have, like problems in prisons in the UK. Um, so there might be some benefits, but yeah, still life is hard, and when you come out of prison, usually life is even harder. Um, So, yeah, I spent some time in this sort of low-income neighborhood, and it wasn't that easy. I thought, maybe some people find community, they find people that are like them, but a lot of the people here, um, there's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of people not getting along. One guy described it as a world without affection, love, connection. It's a world of loneliness and solitude, which is pretty bleak. Um, a lot of guys usually stay in these sort of single room kind of SRO kind of places, right? Single rooms in these kind of buildings, as cheapest place you can get. But they're almost like cells, you know. This is just this tiny room, barely bigger than a bed. But that's what most people can afford if they're living on the basic kind of welfare provision and can't find a job or anything like that. So in a way, getting out, you're still having this feeling of being trapped, incarcerated, not really having much of a life. Some guys stayed in a shelter. This was at a shelter that I volunteered at as well. This was there was a guy that stayed on this bed and had died just about a week, a little over a week before I took this picture. Um, So an older guy, and we looked at his record afterwards, and he had been to prison, I think 18 times on his record there, and most of it was since he was over the age of 60. But he kept on going back and going back. But he did spend his final days here at this shelter. Um, so there are people that are trying to help out, that are trying to extend compassion to these folks, and sometimes they're the only ones there at the end. Um, I'm gonna skip that part because for time, and tell you about Mother House. Mother House was like the main NGO that I worked with. It's sort of an organization that helps with the resettlement of formerly incarcerated people, not just older people. And it's run by this gentleman, or it was run at the time I did my field work by this gentleman whose name is Hiroshi Igarashi. And this is another unique thing about Mother House was that Igarashi actually is himself someone who spent about 20 years in Japanese prisons. Um, and then, his final time in prison, he converted to Catholicism. He came out. He really wanted to do something to help other guys who are coming out of prison, especially a lot of the older guys. He told me. Um, so he set up Mother House as an NGO, and he was really, I mean, really enthusiastic about this project, and he wanted to do more than just give them the basics. He wanted to do more than just give people, shelter. Okay, hook you up with do the paperwork for the benefits and things like that, and then just sort of leave you. I mean, he really wanted to work with these guys, give them a sense of belonging, give them a sense of community, and get them to sort of change what's on the inside. Because his kind of philosophy was that, if you don't change that, doesn't matter if you have a job or you have a place to stay, you're still going to end up going back into prison. Um, so, real lasting change was going to have to be something more than that. And there just wasn't, and there isn't any other sort of organizations in Japan that I know of that are doing that kind of work. Um, so through Mother House, I met G. G was just a nickname that the guys had for him. It kind of means grandpa. And I spent a lot of time with G. I met him not long after he had got out of, he was in police detention. He was arrested not long after I arrived in Japan there um, for stealing. He stole 20 yen. I don't know exactly what that is in it's probably like 15 cents or something like that in American money. Is it's really nothing, 10 cents. Um, but he stole it from a shrine donation box at a Shinto shrine. He was trying to find some money to buy some food. He had sort of run out of money. He had been wandering around trying to find some money, and someone saw him steal the money out of the donation box, and he's got a bit. He had a stroke, and he doesn't walk very well. I'm sure he was very easy to catch. Um, and since he had been to prison on a couple other occasions, um, and had that record, he was detained. Yeah, and he could have faced a sentence up to another year in prison for that offense. Um, but he didn't. Someone from Mother House, I think it was Igarashi, came to the court and talked to the judge. Was able to get him out without a prison sentence, but when he got arrested, he lost his benefits, which meant that he then lost his apartment that he had been living in, um, and he was sort of came out, was homeless, and had no money, right? So it wasn't a good situation. Eventually, Mother House found him a place, as you see here, and with living with another formerly incarcerated person. But he didn't have a lot to do. He was again, he was mostly sat on his bed. We watched TV together, had meals and talked to each other a lot. Um, but he felt he was really isolated, really alone. He had no family, and nothing really to look forward to. When I would ask him about prison or if he wants to go back, he would tell me, of course, no. Prison was hell. But there were a couple times where he had, maybe he was just bored of being at home. He'd gone out, tried to do something. He tried to go to the hospital once, didn't have his proper ID, got kind of confused. And he's kind of a tall guy. He's got kind of a deep voice, and he could be kind of intimidating in some ways. Um, but he nearly got into a fight with someone, which could have easily, again, gotten him into trouble, given his record. So it was very difficult for him, even someone like him who's very disabled, impaired. These kind of incidences, these things could get him back into prison. And a big part of this was that he didn't have any family. Typically, if you got arrested and you had family that could come to the court, talk to the judge, these kind of things, yeah, you wouldn't go to prison. But some people who are alone, and more of these older people are alone, um, they have more likelihood of going to prison. Um, so a few more slides just to show you what happened. Um, as I followed his progress, he had more and more um, uh, sort of connections with the other guys, the other formerly incarcerated guys that had a connection to Mother House, right? And some of them would drop by and say hi or bring some food or something like that. And then this is a picture I took when we were going to the clinic. So one of the other guys at Mother House brought him to the clinic. He was getting screened for dementia at this time. And even though he got kind of a diagnosis of his early dementia, he didn't seem that upset about it, actually. I think he was actually kind of happy that like we were there with him. He wasn't alone. And there were times where the doctor or the other staff were kind of mistaking not me, but the other guys, for maybe family members or something. There was a sense, at least in that context, that it was almost like he had his family there. And I think for him, that was fine. Didn't matter if he had dementia or not, like you had other people around him. So I started to see these changes like that in his attitude and everything. So things were beginning to change, kind of like this lotus growing out of the mud and starting to blossom and become something beautiful. Um, so Mother House was all about, having the doors open, lowering the walls between prison and the outside. They did a lot of work to get newsletters into to people who are incarcerated to write letters to them so that they would then come to Mother House and sort of build that community. And even some of them had children or family members that would come around into the space and help out or just be around. It did have a real family feel. Here we are, like we're putting together a newsletter to send out to prisons. Um, yeah, and it became a kind of space of kinship. So even like this is a little notice board that would always be in there, and people would update it. This one says, "Oh, gee, went to the barber the other day." Um, but all these little basic, sort of everyday uh, kind of signs that someone has noticed that they belong, that they have a place here. I think were really meaningful to these guys, right? And it reminded me, this is from Father Gregory Boyle's work, which I admire so much. But he said kinship was central for guys coming out of prison, and he said if kinship were our goal. Um, we would no longer be promoting justice, we would be celebrating it, right? People need these kinship connections. Last time I was at Mother House, I saw this picture. This is G in the middle here, and he's out with several of the other Mother House people. This is Igarashi. Um, Out sort of enjoying a day out picnic out there, and it looks like almost like a family photo. That's what I love about it. But it's a place where even older people have a way to belong, alongside other people, even guys that have been to prisons, right? um, so I think that kinship space, that can be a place of regeneration, a place of renewal, a place where, even if you don't have family in the traditional sense, you could find that family with others across difference. And I think that's the main um, lesson of Mother House and the way it can change things. But it's a very small experiment in a way. I think it we need more of these and more support for them um, coming in the future as more and more older people are caught in this kind of circuit between prison and life outside. So I'll wrap it up there. That's the gist of what I talk about in my book, and I got lots of stories of different guys that I met and people I work with. Um, this here I'm posing with is Sarah, I think is her name. She's one of the mascots of the Japanese probation service. So I had to get a, a photo with her. But that's me. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And I'm really
So,
interested in what anyone has to say about like how you, whatever you picked up on, how you might relate to it or how you might compare it to anything in your experience. Um, or if you have any questions about Japan, happy to answer those too.
and as people are thinking, Jason, what you might want to do is put the link to that flyer.
Oh, right, right, yeah.
Do you want to say something about that?
Just let me find that. I can
So
see if
there's
I
a
can.
percentage off on the book, 20%.
I think it's yeah, 30%, I think. Yeah. Let's see. It is in paperback, so it's not a super expensive book, but definitely helps. Let me find that flyer. I know I got it here.
Well, you know what, we can do that later.
I'll just
Let's
attach it and I'll put it in
in
the
the chat.
chat there.
Okay,
Yeah, anyone can use that discount code.
great. So what kinds of thoughts, questions, reactions, feelings do people have? Elaine?
First of all, thank you so much for this talk. It was really amazing. So, and your work is awesome. I was curious what you noticed about kind of the idea of like correctional officers in Japan versus correctional officers here, and also sort of the idea of like rehabilitation versus punitive, kind of how those things compare in your perspective. Does that make sense? Is that enough context?
Yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. No, so I mean, there was a lot of different kind of ideas about correctional officers, I think, in the prison. Some people had good relationships with them, some people didn't. The kind of one thing I thought was interesting is that there's the nickname or the kind of slang, I guess, what you call a correctional officer in Japan was is oyaji, which is like it means like old man, like means like father, like it's like a kind of term for father, like almost a derogatory term for father or intimate term for father, oyaji. Um, and when I was leaving my field work as a goodbye gift, they gave me a t-shirt that said oyaji on it. So I don't know if they thought like since I was hanging around like always observing them asking the questions, maybe they thought of me that way. But it's an interesting thing because it's a kind of kinship term in a way. But it's kind of playful in that sense. But I think some people did actually, have decent relationships with them. The uh, yeah, just like rehabilitation in Japanese prisons is basically it's work. That's all there's very little beyond that, right? The idea is just you go and you work and that work experience or whatever is how we rehabilitate you. It's work and discipline. Um, and there has been since some reforms that they made in the early 2000s, about 2004, it's become more punitive, I think. More sentences handed out, more like longer sort of mandatory sentences and things like that. um, you know uh, it, it's still much shorter than typically in the States, but yeah, it has become more punitive, and I think a lot of that is sort of there's very good organizations for what they would call like victims advocacy organizations, right? That have a very big voice and are very much about trying to push for more sort of punitive sentencing, and this is of course very politically popular as well, right? So this one of the things I was really hoping for in this book is to get these stories, to get these voices out, and people kind of see like, whoa, this all these these punitive policies that we have are ending up with with a lot of older, disabled, people with learning disabilities, those kind of people in jail. And that's not what they're for, right? So to get people to rethink that.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was Reiko.
Thank you so much. I have to leave soon, so I feel funny asking a question. I may have to like walk out partway through your answer. But I have so many questions. I guess the one I'll ask, which might be shorter, is if we imagine that the carceral system in the United States is to at least some extent held up by ideologies of fear and demonizing a certain group of people as threatening to so-called law-abiding people, um, how is such punitive policy kind of justified to the public when the like are older people being portrayed as like drains or threats or dangerous? I mean, what is sort of the ideological underpinnings, especially in a context of putative respect for elders? How is it that this punitive policy and its disproportionate results, how is it narrated to the public as necessary? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, what's the ideology behind it?
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap with with the ways in which people living with disabilities, people living with psychological conditions, and these kind of disorders are sort of the way that the kind of fear and around that. I think that is very similar to sort of how people are viewing these older people that are, isolated, impoverished, and sort of committing crimes and stuff like that, right? I think that in the same way that people, yeah, I think there's a lot of, well, I think there's a lot of general anxiety about long lives and aging, about, what's going to happen, when I get older, dementia and all of that. I think there's a lot of anxiety about that that makes people sort of very uh, fearful of aging. And I think to some extent, this idea that we can sort of lock that away, we can just sort of put that away and not have to look at it, is part of what's behind this. I think it's one reason why people don't kind of mind. One guy I talked to at an NGO kind of said, like, everyone knows you're not supposed to, discriminate against people based on age and things like that. But, if they committed a crime, then it's okay. Then you can do that, and it makes it, all right. So, do you know what I mean? So, like, there's a lot of this kind of unvoiced kind of, yeah, fear and anxiety around aging that I think is coming out of this. But I do think, yeah, there's a lot of overlap. About 15% of the older guys that are in prison, not just guys, but older people in prison in Japan, about 15% of them have dementia, and probably many more undiagnosed. I think there's a lot of overlap with that kind of as well. So, but I think that yeah, it's mixed up in there. Um, but I do think it's definitely a population that's marginalized. If you have family, if you're sort of well integrated and stuff like that, it's fine. But it's these kind of singular individuals, these isolated individuals, they get marginalized.
Reiko, before you run, do you have another question you want to ask?
Well, I guess my follow-up would be related to what you said, which connects to the first question I wanted to ask, which really is to do with the reality of disposability of elder people in a culture that, again, sort of ostensibly values elders and kinship obligations. So I wonder if these folks, if they don't have family, they're like kind of by definition rejects. Like like I wonder if
Yeah,
it's if people see that as a commentary on them, like, oh, you don't have any family to take care of you, therefore you must be somehow an
yeah,
abject creature. But
yeah.
also, might it be a projection about people's anxieties to do with the loss of those obligations and commitments? I mean, it seems
Mm.
sort of counterintuitive, but there does, maybe I'm mythologizing the obligations to older people. But if that ever existed and it's deteriorating, it seems like that in itself would cause anxiety. Like who, like, you know,
Yeah, for
that
sure.
people themselves are not going to have the care and support that they thought that they were entitled to when they get older.
Yeah, I think that's it. But I do think it has become worse over the years, and I think the kind of bounds of what can constitute like a good old age, you know, has become narrower, and people have sort of less integrated, and I think there's less empathy and less sort of understanding of those folks who don't kind of fit that narrow category of, you know, either being, you know, healthy and independent, you know, all the way until you're 100, or, you know, being, you know, within a family and things like that. So, um, yeah. A lot of these guys, you know, they're very sort of independent minded, they're very creative. They sort of been had really interesting lives as a result of that, but not a lot of stability in later life and nowhere to go. But yeah,
Mhm.
thanks, Rika, and like let's stay in touch.
I don't know if you see that Greg wrote, and Joe, I see that you have your hand up. Greg wrote a thing that says if people are committing crimes in part, in some sense, to get a bed, three hots and a cot, such as that may be, I get the sense that the Japanese criminal court system has a much faster, quicker time between the commission of a crime and getting sentenced to prison. Is that the case? For
Yeah.
in the USA, it's months, sometimes years between arrest and being charged with a crime and sentencing. Is it not that long in Japan?
Yeah, it's as far as I know, I don't know like kind of statistics and stuff like that, but in my experience, hearing about these cases, yeah, it's fairly quick. Especially, I mean, these, you know, a lot of the guys were just sort of, you know, they were stealing things or they were shoplifting or they were there's something or even like if you go to a restaurant, you leave without paying and things like that. That's considered like a form of like fraud. So it can be, you know,
Wow.
but people then will go back to prison fairly quickly. That guy I mentioned at the beginning who was saying they felt like a wall was between him and the world. Um, you know, yeah, about a month after that we had that conversation, maybe not even, he was back in prison. Um, so it was
Hmm.
really quickly, but
Okay. Joe, what do you got?
Oh, hi there. I'm sorry. I apologize for arriving late, but I'm glad that was able to step in at the right time. So as a senior myself, I came out of prison at 65. I've been home for 6 years now, or just about 6 years. And so issues around aging and incarceration pull on the strings of my heart. So I'm curious to know, what you describe as the myth of honoring elders, that is a myth. And that's very interesting to me. I'm curious to know what percentage of the incarcerated population in Japan, are seniors. You may have mentioned that already, but I don't know.
yeah, it's about 1 in 5 are over 60. It's
And what about
one.
what are reentry services like, transitional services like in Japan in general that may or may not include services that are directly that can be utilized by seniors?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a variety, but one of the big issues is that in order to come out on parole, you have to have sort of someone in the community that's gonna sort of vouch for you. You have to have like a, you know, family member, something like that. And so for a lot of the older guys in particular, almost, I mean, most of them do not get to come out on parole and have, you know, finish their sentence in the community. They do the whole sentence in prison, and they come out and they're just sort of kicked out, right? There's nothing, they're done with them. Um, they have recently started a kind of service where you know, older people living with disabilities can sort of uh, be connect like they sort of connect with them before they're released, and then they try to find like a suitable accommodations or something like that, and you know, try to get them connected to certain services that they might need ahead of time. And then, meet them at the gate and make that transition smoother. But it's not it it's by choice. You don't have to use that kind of service, and you don't have to stay with it once you're there. So it's like a lot of people might go into it at first, but then kind of drop out. It's not it doesn't do the whole thing. It's a good first step though, I think. Sometimes guys will go right into a care home, sometimes they'll find their own apartment or something like that and have other services. But and it varies across Japan. But so there are some of these services, and then there are these sort of NGOs and charities and things like that as well. But yeah, very, very little. Still, the mindset is, you know, uh, the best way to sort of do resettlement, reintegration is you get a job. Um,
Right, right, that's the problem.
yeah, that's the problem.
Right. I don't know why, and I don't know much about Japanese society, but I have this notion or illusion, I guess, that there's a more, a more highly evolved sense of belonging there that, or social connectedness that apparently I'm hearing that that's not really the case.
Hmm.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm sorry I missed the first half, but it's nice to be able to chime in. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Audrey?
Hi, thank you so much for all of that. I have so many questions, so I'll try to pick just one. I'll pick the one that's more gerontology related, so I don't accidentally take somebody's criminology question. Um, it sounds like you were doing life reviews when you were there. Is that what you were doing? Um,
A little bit.
Okay. What is the possibility of like journalists or other professors doing kind of inside out where older people inside could do life reviews? So, the last time I taught was actually last year. I'm having some issues trying to get back inside. And when I taught, I did a philosophy old age class, and all the
Mm,
students had to do a life review with somebody over the age of 65. And so, of course, the incarcerated students, it was easiest for them to do that with another incarcerated person.
mhm,
So, of course, some of the life reviews I'm reading, and for those of you who don't know, it's basically it's like an anthropological way to do a biography, but it's like really specific to things about like the stage of life you're in. Um, and when I was reading these, I was like, oh my God, these are the best life reviews I've ever read because like it's about philosophy, it's about age, it's about prison, it's about like what is the meaning of their life. It's not some of them because they're serving life, you know. So I mean, I'm just sitting there thinking like maybe Japan needs there to be some kind of movement where people can get that qualitative experience of like what it's like to be them because like you said like it's like okay, we don't want to deal with our mortality, we don't want to deal with thinking about being old, oh, let's lock them all up and forget about them, that's how we deal with it, right? And I'm thinking okay, that's the problem, the solution is the problem. So is there like in your opinion, in your professional work that you do, is there a way to increase the public's exposure or access to like what it's like to be an older person and in prison in Japan and to even be tempted, even if like there's a little part of me that's like, how much is this three hots and a cot thing in mythology? Because like people say that
yeah.
around, yeah, people say that around here too. And I'm like, no, that doesn't happen. Like, like, or it happens very rarely, but like, is it really common? Are people gonna then blame the older people? Like when you mentioned the whole like when you show the picture of the people working, I instantly thought of like the entrance to Auschwitz, right? Like work makes you free,
Hmm.
and then you were talking to Joe a second ago, and I'm like, these people are getting out at the age where they are retired. They're getting
Mhm.
out where retirement is what is supposed to be their life stage, and their contingency on getting out is essentially being younger. Like like they're only allowed to get out if they can get a job, but they're at a stage in life where they shouldn't have to get a job.
Yeah.
So I mean, so what do you think is the chances of increasing like some kind of like academic, I don't know, mouthpiece or bullhorn to communicate to people the carceral system is ageist. It is based on, rehabilitating the typical criminal who's between the ages of like 20 and 30.
Absolutely, all those things. I mean, you got it. Yeah. Um, I think that I mean, I would love to do that kind of work that you've done, learn about that, in Japan. But like I said, it's very difficult to sort of get into these to Japanese prisons. One kind of interesting thing that's happening now is that starting next year, they're changing the prison policy. So that you always get a work sentence, right? Everyone's sentenced to work in prison, but they're changing that now, so you don't have to. They can give out this just sort of. I think they're calling it like detention sentences or something like that. I hope that doesn't mean people are just going to be locked in their cells all day or something like that. But um, they're along with that. So partially that's happening because there are so many older people in prison who are unable to sort of work in the factory all day, every day. So so they had to find something else for them to do. So with this change in the sentencing, they're also sort of thinking about, well, how can we bring in maybe some more rehabilitative stuff, some maybe some education, maybe some arts stuff, whatever it is, and so there might be more of that happening gradually in Japan, and so there might be an opening there, especially to work with older people, um, and do these kind of life reviews. I really think that would be yeah, huge, transformative. um, you know yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm actually working with there's a guy in Japan who's curated some shows of sort of artwork made by guys that are incarcerated in Japan, and he's going to be coming over to England in a couple months, and he wants to kind of learn about all the arts and prison stuff in England and sort of bring some of those ideas back to Japan. So this is very new stuff, but there are models all over the world that we can draw on, so that's cool. Thank you. Let's stay in touch too. Sounds really interesting what you do.
Jason, I have a question, and maybe I was picking up on this in the wrong way, but when you described the person who was at Mother House, who ran it, you talked about him in the past tense. So does he no longer run it, or what?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't have time to sort of get to that. So he no longer runs it. Um, I went back to Japan last summer to do some follow-up stuff. Oh, I mean, I did the work in 2018. I was meant to go back to Japan in 2020 and do some follow-up, but then lockdown, pandemic, and all that. And so I finally made it back last summer. Before coming over, I made contact with him, with Mother House. I was trying to get in contact with Igarashi again, and wasn't able to get in contact with him, and found out actually he got arrested. And it was a terrible, incident that with someone who had come, a younger woman who had come to Mother House, and typically he would sort of not directly sort of get involved in those kind of cases and give it to someone else at the but in this instance he did, and the incident happened. So I'm kind of grappling with this right now too, because I wrote about him, and the time I was there, he was quite inspirational character. But in those intervening years, I was hearing all these stories from other guys, things were starting to change. So yeah, he got arrested. I think he's been sentenced by now. And over the summer he was awaiting sentencing still, but um and had been in detention. But it's a real sad case, and But I think that's, these organizations sometimes, they're fragile, and it's difficult, especially when they're headed by someone who's like so, such a big force, such a big voice. It's sad to see that kind of thing happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
And Thomas, you'll get the last question in here.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you so much, Jason. Excellent, that really inspiring presentation. We've got all sorts of problems, obviously, in the UK now with sentencing. Why don't they have community sentences in Japan, or do they, to sort of look after the elderly more humanely?
Yeah, I think that would be great if they did that more, and definitely the recidivism rate is lower if people have those community sentences, and they're getting support. And Japan actually has a really interesting system of voluntary probation officers, they call them. Just people in the community who are, they get trained and everything, but yeah, it's a sort of this, system. Anyway, I don't have time to go into the voluntary probation officer system thing. It's been around for a while. It's extensive, and it tends to work pretty well. Reintegrate people into the neighborhoods a little bit more. But yeah, like I said, those policies where it ends up that older people don't have connections in the community and end up spending their whole sentence in prison. That's a real issue. Yeah. Uh, so yeah, lots of, room for coming up with alternatives, but it can be hard. A lot of the, times when you're trying to resettle someone, people in the neighborhood don't want someone in the neighborhood that's been in prison. A lot of care homes won't take you if you've been in prison, especially certain types of crimes. Like if you committed arson, there, good luck trying to find a care home that'll take you. And so, then, people just kind of end up in these very small, rooms like I showed you, or in shelters and things like that. So, and there's no sense of, yeah, that community there. Thanks, Tom.
Jason,
Jason.
fabulous. Thank you. All right. Well, folks, we will pick up on more Zoom conversations in the coming semester. And this has been wonderful. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you again.
Jason.